Ladies and gentlemen, we'll make a start on today's webinar. Today's Adam Deep Dive webinar is entitled CSI 2.0 Tech-Driven Forensic Medicine. And we'll be touching on topics around forensic pathology and forensic medicine heavily today. My name's Professor Chris Bain. I'm the Professor of Digital Health at Monash University, based in the Faculty of IT. I lead our cross-university alliance in digital health. And this is the second session this year in a series of monthly webinars. I'd like to firstly acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people today. I respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm sitting today, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. A little bit about Monash. I'm conscious that we have registered for this session people from around our state, Victoria, and our country, Australia, but also from many countries around the world, which is really exciting for us. Some of the work you'll see today, or all of the work, is in partnership with an organisation called the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, which is one of only a handful really of such institutes around the world. So this work has potential international significance. Monash University is in the top 2 universities in Australia by size. We are based in the state of Victoria. We have multiple campuses in Victoria, but we also have a global footprint. We have a long-standing campus in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, new international campus in Indonesia, which is the first Western uni with a campus in that country. We have a centre in Prato in Italy, just near Florence. We have a longer-standing partnership with Warwick University. And then we also have links, particularly through our Faculty of IT, with several universities in China, in Harbin and Southeast University, and also with the world-famous IITB Mumbai, IIT Bombay, hence the acronym. In addition, we have an evolving partnership with the Quetta Centre for Digital Health, also based at IITB, and I expect some of our colleagues from Quetta are online today. So our Alliance for Digital Health, for those who haven't heard of it, it's our main mechanism for engaging with people around the university, across our partners and into the healthcare industry, around with digital health as a focus. We have nearly 35 entities who are partners, many of whom are member or parts of the university, including in other countries, but some of whom are also hospitals and SMEs and others. And I welcome conversations from people afterwards who are very interested in hearing more about our Alliance for Digital Health. And we have, based on our current strategy, 9 topic-based focus areas for our digital health work. And these have been devised as part of a strategic exercise several years ago now, looking at synergies between what we do from an IT point of view, but also where there's strong interest and drive from the healthcare industry and our partners. And the topic that we're focusing on today is this area of forensic informatics, which is this intersection of how we use IT techniques in the support of the practice of forensic medicine and forensic pathology. And that expresses itself in a number of ways and is centred on our partnership with BIFM. Our speakers today. So the first speaker, these are presented in order, is Associate Professor Richard Bassett. Richard is a senior forensic odontologist and head of the identification service at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, and he's had a really interesting career in this field. Richard is also the Director of Research at BIFM and also head of the Correlate University Department of Forensic Medicine at Monash University. Dr. Hans de Boer will be the second speaker. Hans is a consultant forensic pathologist at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, and I know has experiences from Europe as well, and we will hear from Hans. Third on the list is Dr. Yasmin George, who is a colleague of mine in the Faculty of Information Technology. Yasmin is a lecturer in data science and AI department, and also a founding member of a newly formed lab, which is the only dedicated medical AI lab in the university, called the AIM for Health Lab, or Augmented Intelligence and Multimodal Analytics. And finally, but not least, we have Professor Tim Dwyer, who's Director of the Data Visualization and Analytics Lab in the Faculty of IT, and importantly also our Associate Dean Research in the Monash Uni Faculty of IT. Each of them will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we have a panel session at the end for people to ask questions. By all means, please put questions in the question function to the right of your main viewing window, and I shall do my best to see that they are answered by our participant panel members throughout the session. So if you have any questions for our speakers after today's event, you can use this email address to contact me. I can field those questions on your behalf, conscious that we might get quite a few. And also, and you should be contacted about this as a registrant for today's event. You will have a link available to you to view this afterwards if yourself or colleagues who couldn't make it want to view the recording that will be sent to you in the next week or so. So with that, we shall begin, and I shall hand over the speaking slot to Associate Professor Richard Bassett.
Right, just hoping that's sharing okay.
It is.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks everybody, and welcome to this webinar. So as Chris said, I'm the Head of Department of Forensic Medicine here at Monash and Deputy Director of the VIFM, so I wear these sort of two different hats and navigate through two different bureaucracies, etc., but that's all fun and games. And today I'm not really talking about individual projects. I'm going to talk about forensic medicine as a whole and what it is and what it's for, and perhaps more importantly, some of the issues we have with our data in general and specifically, and also some wider issues that we're sort of working on in the global community as well. So once I get this thing to go forwards, there we go. So the first thing I wanted to think about, and this is really just in the realm of forensic medicine, the mega trends that are happening around the world, and digital transformation is upon us. It's unequal in its distribution and its uptake, but there has been major progress. There's lots of international engagement on this. And when you think about human rights abuses in particular, the digital transformation means in one respect, we have far more visibility over human rights abuses and crimes that are committed around the world. We see a lot more of it. So whether it's actually increased or we're just seeing more is a question for another day. We're also forced, of course, the world generally to do more with less. The population increase, the resources, the conflicts and migration and instability that is happening around the world at the moment makes things a very interesting milieu in which to work. Machine learning in particular, of course, it's becoming smarter and more common. We've all been, gleefully playing with our chat GPT-4 programs and finding which essays we can write and how we can pass our exams. A lot of machine learning and AI is not properly regulated. And while we've discovered an enormous number of use cases that are applicable in forensic medicine, both locally and globally, it's how the implementation happens and how you incorporate it into your workflow. And I think Hans will talk more about this, how courts deal with, in particular, algorithms that are created and how they get explained in court. And people in general, especially in global north, have great expectations in terms of, they're more medically literate, they are more human rights aware, and they are far more unaccepting of the fact that their relatives can die and go disappear without an explanation. So there's greater expectations on the validity, accuracy, reliability, and use of forensic medicine, medical legal death investigation findings, particularly in cases of unlawful killings, which encompass war crimes, mass graves, femicide, deaths in custody, etc., etc. And the other thing I wanted to touch on was the rise of institutions and how they have impacted on forensic medicine over the last sort of 30 years or so. Forensic medicine used to be very much an individual medical practice type arrangement where you were a police surgeon. And having that institutionalized reduces the dependence on individual practitioners, and it also gives collections of forensic medical scientists and doctors to begin to think about things other than their day-to-day caseload and start thinking about wider public health and even global issues of death and injury prevention. Institutions allow us to collaborate. So having this institution here has allowed us to make this alliance with Faculty of IT at Monash and with organisations such as the UN. Without the backing of an institution, these things are really difficult to organise. And also, the other thing about institutions is the ability to start implementing quality management tools, not only for the way an institution runs, but quality management tools in terms of your evidence, its reliability, the scientific backing behind the evidence, how it's presented in court, etc., etc. And so the criminal justice system, this is just an aside really that you guys can sort of investigate yourself if you've got the urging, but criminal justice is not infallible. Once the trial process is over, the person is found guilty. That's not always the end of the story, because there are a significant number of wrongful convictions around the world. Understanding the size of the problem is almost impossible, because of course, if the conviction is never overturned and the conviction stands, you never know if it was right or wrong. So there's a mob called the Innocence Project.org operating out of America. And in total, since 1989 to 2015, they've exonerated 1,580 odd people from their convictions. Those convictions were proven to be wrong. 50% of those cases, they got the actual perpetrator. A lot of this is DNA driven, but not all of it. So there are failings in the application or even the foundational validity of some forensic science that is resulting in wrongful convictions, which is, it's a terrible thing to be put in jail for years, even on death row, as some of these people were, for a crime they could not possibly have committed. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind as we go through this. Now, a little more close to home, what does the coroner do? So the coroner accepts all the reportable deaths in the state of Victoria, and the coroners are lawyers, so they are not forensic medical people. They are the judicial officers charged with investigation of a death. And that list down on the left-hand side is really a basic list of the sorts of cases that get reported to the state coroner. And the state coroner is not a body that convicts or ascribes blame. It's more about public health and safety. And the typical example is a particular brand of heater is faulty and it's resulted in the deaths of a number of people across metropolitan Melbourne. The coroner will hold an inquest into the reasoning behind why those deaths occurred, what the particular fault is with that particular heater, etc. So they've resulted in things like bike helmets, seat belts, pool fences, etc., over the years. So really, it's kind of the public-facing way that unnatural or unexpected deaths can be investigated in terms of when they appear as a group. So it's making systemic changes to make society a bit safer. Us, on the other hand, we are the other half of the building, and we provide the medical investigation into the cause, manner of death, and it's our data that the coroner uses to make their determinations. So it's, why did you do that on purpose? So it's, the principal practice of medicine and science to the needs of the courts and the wider justice system. So really it's an interpretation of findings and evidence that we find on the people that we examine, the interpretation of that so that the legal system can understand it. And we perform probably 7,000, we get 7,000 cases reported to our institution annually. The total number of deaths in Victoria is around 40 to 42,000 a year, dying of all causes. About 7,000 of those come to us because they are a reportable case and they don't have a death certificate. Of those, only half have a full autopsy, and a big part of that reason is the introduction of post-mortem CT scanning back in 2005. Prior to that, it was around 78 to 80% of people had a full autopsy. implementation of that imaging has meant that in 30% of cases, we can now determine a cause of death without the need for an invasive autopsy. Later this year, hopefully, we'll get an MRI scanner in the building to be used for examination of the deceased. And there's lots of research opportunities and questions about how that will be implemented, what the benefits of it will be, and what sort of cases we would like to use it on. So traditionally, forensic medicine's a hard thing to research, forensic pathology in particular. It's very difficult to conduct experiments simply because you conduct experiments on humans, and that can't really be done in the things that we want to investigate. And so the traditional research techniques, which is human analog models, animal models, and more recently digital models, still won't provide answers for a whole raft of unanswerable questions that we get asked in court. A very simple example would be, how old is that bruise? How hard was this person hit to cause this particular injury? So there's lots and lots of questions that we are unable to answer. And so we've gone through human analog models, animal models, digital models, and we're left with machine learning models. So human analog models have been used forever. Very common example is handgun fired into a block of ballistics gel in the attempt to replicate what happens inside a human body, or strength tests on bones, or what happens to a plastic head filled with some sort of dye when it's shot with a handgun. So these aren't human. There's certain references or inferences, I suppose, you can draw from this sort of work, but it's not biological, it's not human. So there's so many variables that aren't considered. So how reliable are the results on these sorts of experiments? Probably not very. And then extending one step further, animal models. Of course, they're biological tissue, but it's not human. Doing experiments on the skull thickness of a pig, for example, is not going to relate very well to the skull thickness of a human in terms of the amount of force required to crack a particular skull. So again, can't be extrapolated. Digital models have been in for at least 20 years, I'm thinking, back when I think about my own experience looking at bite marks, which is what this slide shows. Digital models really haven't added anything to the science of bite mark analysis. It hasn't made it more reliable. It's still incredibly unreliable. Hasn't made it more reliable. It has given it this sort of veneer of science. So really what you're seeing here is no different to drawing a bite mark on an acetate overlay and laying it over a photograph. It's literally no different. So while they look fancy and they look nice, they don't actually add much to the science. The same is true with facial reconstruction. Top left, the traditional method, tissue depth markers on a replica of a skull, and the facial musculature is built up around those tissue depth markers. All of these other options on this slide are pretty much a computerized version of that. Doesn't mean it's accurate, doesn't mean it's any more accurate than putting clay on plaster. So the digital models are okay, but there's nothing intelligent about them. It's literally just a better way to prevent information that used to be done manually. So can we enhance our techniques? So, and this is the main issue with our data. So we have a non-standard image space, non-standard medical post-mortem CT image space, and non-standard texts, and nothing is labelled. So we have a giant case management system with lots of data in it. Nothing is labelled. None of the images are standard. Our CT images are all different from, there's no standard position, for example. Our photography, while pretty good, is still not labelled with anything except a case number. So being able to find stuff in our data to research is a perennial problem that we're hoping our alliance with Faculty of IT at Monash will be able to help us with. And our databases are quite extensive. We have over 100,000 full body CT scans in our database, all ages, all genders, all causes of death, and a huge number of photographs. As I said, none of them are labelled. And there's so many possibilities for correlation studies, for looking for like cases when you're a worker when you're a pathologist doing a particular case. And at present, we just aren't able to perform that sort of advanced searching function. So when I think about what is possible or what might be possible in the future, you'll hear today about automated anatomical reconstruction and ballistic analysis. We're also working on trauma analysis. Disease diagnosis is a long way down the track, but who knows what we can find. And the most important thing to think about in our work is that machine can't give the answer. It has to be a person. So it has to have the human in the loop all the time, examining this stuff to make sure that what the machine is saying makes sense. And even that bit of workflow and that sort of quality management hasn't been nutted out in terms of how we might go about that. So when I think about end goals for, or where I'd like to see advanced analytics in forensic medicine, it's perhaps being able to enhance the capacity to improve cause of death diagnosis in terms of being able to diagnose cause of death on more cases through imaging alone, especially with the impact our new MRI scanner will have. Injury pattern recognition and causation analysis, and finding like cases where particular injuries are very, very similar. Developing efficiencies so that the deceased pass through our system in a more timely way and released to families quicker to plan for their funerals, etc., etc. And a big one you'll hear a bit about today from Yasmin, improving automated ID procedures. So we're working with Department of Defence on facial recognition for the deceased and also facial reconstruction for the deceased. And that leads straight into faster and more cost-effective identification in mass fatality situations. And of course, overlaying all of this, we're hoping that some of the tools we develop in terms of labelling, diagnostics, anatomical reconstruction may be applicable at some point in time into clinical medicine. Now, I only want to say one more thing really, and that's on humanitarian forensic medicine and data collection. I've only just been recently involved working for the Special Rapporteur for extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions at the UN. And one of the subjects we're working on is femicide. And what really struck me is the lack of global data in collecting information on unlawful killings of all sorts, but femicide in particular. So there's femicide, war crimes, mass graves, deaths in custody, and the vast majority of them are unreported and or insufficiently investigated. And a lot of the systems that around the world that need to deal with these sorts of deaths are under-resourced, not independent, people don't have adequate training. So that, of course, all just leads to a lack of justice for the deceased or their families. My light's gone out. Get back on. So what I'm interested in working on, which might be of interest in the digital health space, is a really simple data collection tool for gathering information related to unlawful killings that is applicable at the grassroots. So these are the people without government backing, without resources, who have the ability to report cases of unlawful killings. And also, of course, that pathway to allow reporting and data gathering to a central repository that's anonymous and secure for people. Data must be able to be coded. So we're looking at, I've got a bunch of honours students at the moment, the Global Challenge students, looking at developing a structure for this tool, how it would look, what sort of questions might be on it, what sort of data we require it to be empty. And we're basing that on the UNODC's mortuary surveillance tool, which is looking at injury and death in lower middle income countries from all sources. We're looking at tailoring a sort of subsection of that that's for unlawful deaths. But the question we have, of course, you can develop this tool and how do you get it accepted, how do you get it disseminated, and how do you get it implemented, which really is all part of the digital transformation age. Everyone's got a smartphone, and I envisage some tool that can be used on a smartphone by ICRC investigators, by forensic investigators belonging to a particular jurisdiction who might want to report something, but their government might not want to hear it. So there's lots of different challenges to meet in that space. I think I will end my talk there, and kind of, as I said, a sort of broad brush approach to machine learning and forensic medicine. And I think you'll get way down into more detail with the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And just while anyone ponders any specific questions for Richard, because we do have a couple of minutes, Richard and I obviously have discussed many of these things over a number of years. Richard, could you maybe shed some light on your tsunami experience and where IT might have helped if you had tools at your disposal?
Yeah, so I spent quite a lot of time after the tsunami in Thailand, the Boxing Day tsunami 2004. And the section of the tsunami we were dealing with was 5,000 deceased people. Half of them were tourists, half of them were Thai locals. And they all deceased as a result of the tsunami. Essentially, they all drowned. And the bodies started to be collected the day after. And at that point, if we had the technology, for instance, facial recognition of deceased, if we had have had that technology and at the point of body collection, someone had taken a photograph of that person's face before they decomposed, before they had any significant post-mortem changes, it's my belief that a great proportion of those 5,000 could have been identified quite rapidly and quite easily. As it was, the bodies were collected. There wasn't sufficient storage. There was no refrigeration. So by the time they got their forensic examinations, decomposition was quite extensive. There was no way to visually identify anyone. So everyone had the same full procedure of dental examination, DNA examination, etc., etc. And it took a year to identify about 4,000 out of the 5,000. And the cost of that was cooperation from about 30 countries. And the cost of that would have been into the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So the benefit of that facial recognition technology in this sort of scenario, if we can get it to work, is undeniable.
Thank you for that, Richard. There are a number of scenarios in which the work of the Institute happens where it's more than dealing with one patient at a time. And it's particularly in some of those scenarios where IT could have a real role. We've got a couple of minutes up our sleeve. Richard will be available for questions through the session and later. So don't be scared to pop your questions into the chat. There might be one that can be just touched on offline now, Richard, about ethics in forensic research, but I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Hans de Boer for his talk. Thank you, Hans.
Yeah, sure. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Let's see. No, no. Everybody see this? Hope so. Everybody okay with this? Can everybody see this?
Yes, we can, Hans.
Excellent. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Indeed, my name is Hans de Boer. I'm a forensic pathologist at the VIFM. I've been working here now for 2 years, indeed. Before that, I was a forensic pathologist in the Netherlands. And I've been asked to talk to you about a little bit about artificial intelligence and forensic pathology specifically. So we'll touch on where AI essentially is being used now, what is the state of the science at this moment in time, and then I'll delve into a little bit more in detail about what I think as a practitioner of artificial intelligence. We'll basically zoom in on some of the limitations and challenges that I see, and that particularly relates to some of the issues that Richard already mentioned, the lack of labeled data, the individualization of actually research findings to a particular forensic case, but also how I believe AI, well, will be used in court, or what the problems are with using AI in court. So why am I giving this talk? Well, first of all, some things that I'm not. I'm not a specialist in artificial intelligence. I'm not like one of these other people in the seminar this evening that actually does artificial intelligence research. I'm also not particularly computer savvy. I'm not a big tech head, and I'm also not a typical early adopter. However, I am giving this talk because I'm a forensic pathologist with quite a broad academic interest, and I think that AI is definitely, whether we want it or not, going to change the way that we practice. And I think that as a specialist, it's important to be part of that movement, and also to be able to guide that movement more or less. And I'm usually interested to share my views. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, you can discuss that with me later. So Richard already touched on this, but a little bit about what is forensic pathology. Here at the VIFM, we have a wide array of forensic sciences, but me as a forensic pathologist, we are medical doctors working for a legal context. So our primary, how do you say that, clients or recipients are the courts, mainly the Coroner's Court of Victoria, but also the Supreme Court of Victoria when it's, or other more criminal courts when we're dealing with the criminal jurisdictions. So both these recipients are basically dictate what kind of reports we write, and also which questions that we have to answer. And we as forensic pathologists only deal with dead individuals. Forensic medicine, clinical forensic medicine, deals with living people, but as a pathologist, we only deal with the dead. That said, we do work a lot with other fields of forensic science: toxicologists, anthropologists, odontologists, geneticists, clinicians, and so on. But our main focus is on the examination of the dead. So what are the questions that we help to answer, or that we answer ourselves? As forensic pathologists, I think it's important to reiterate that, because it gives some context to my talk, but also shows us or gives us a kind of idea where our academic efforts should be aimed at, in my opinion. Of course, the most important question that we often get asked, and that everybody identifies a forensic pathologist with, is the question of what is the cause of death. However, that is not necessarily the most important question that we answer. I mean, cause of death can be very clear, but there can be many other questions that are relevant to a case. For instance, what's the manner of death? And with manner of death, we talk about whether it's a suicide, a homicide, its natural causes, or is it unknown, for instance. Now, this manner of death is not something that we determine, but our information helps to determine, helps the coroner or to determine the context of the case. Similar, what are the circumstances surrounding death? When did somebody die? This is a big issue in forensic pathology, or actually all post-mortem examinations, to estimate the post-mortem interval. Very difficult, and I would say that we're almost never possible. That it's almost never possible to give an accurate estimation of the post-mortem interval. But it's a very relevant question for courts, police, and all our other clients, so to speak. Which underlying natural diseases were present? So we are pathologists, so that means we are first and foremost tissue examiners who diagnose diseases on tissues. So so a big part of our work is diagnosing diseases. Same with injuries, which injuries were present, and also how were they caused. Who is the diseased? So identification. A substantial portion of the cases that we do don't have a confirmed identity when they are submitted to the VIFM. So helping to identify someone is definitely one of our core issues. And these questions are not always the case. So the context of the case or the questions that are raised in the case informs the extent of the investigation. So not every case is dealt with in the same way. Every case is dealt with within a bespoke forensic pathology, I would say, more or less. So we don't always answer the same questions, and it's very much dependent on the case what our efforts focus on. Now, a lot of people think that we as forensic pathologists only do autopsies, but we have a wide variety of sources of information, and that complicates things when you're talking about research. We have, for instance, external and internal examination, like I said, the autopsy. But however, there's also post-mortem imaging, the CT, and also the soon-to-arrive MRI that Richard already touched on, microscopy, so histology images, medical records, antemortem imaging, information from scene visits or scene photos, police reports, other documents. And then there's a whole suite of extra of other sources of information from related specialties, so microbiology, biochemistry, toxicology, and there's consultation of other specialists, for instance, a toxicologist or, for instance, a anthropologist. And all these sources of information dictate the type of data we process. So it's not just a autopsy finding that a forensic pathologist needs to interpret. There's a whole variety of data in all different ways presented to us in either text, photos, digitally, and so on and so on. So again, that places some form of challenges on the research that we deal with. A little bit about AI and the way I understand AI, just to make sure that we have the same understanding. The way I understand artificial intelligence is that it replicates a human intellectual process, so either perceiving, synthesizing, or inferring information through machines. So AI is, I would say, more or less a buzzword at this moment in time. Everybody talks about it. There's a lot of funding going into AI. And the whole term is laden with, well, meaning and expectation. Also, it's a bit of a difficult word to define, I would say. I mean, what is artificial and also what is intelligence? Those are philosophical issues we won't delve into now. But I think it's important that AI, for me, implies the perception of decision making or the perception of a problem solving by technology. So essentially, AI is, in its bare essential, a information transformation that takes place automatically. So this can be really simple, for instance, translating text or pictures into words, or can also imply more complex decision making, for instance, Google searches or producing whole texts based on limited input and so on and so on. But this whole automated process of input, transformation into output, I think that's the essence of artificial intelligence. Talking about artificial intelligence in that way, me as a practitioner, what do I then expect from artificial intelligence? Well, there's two things essentially that I would expect from our artificial intelligence. First, that it either speeds up anything I do, or that it makes the processes that we do smarter, or that it actually helps me solve problems that I cannot do on my own. So in terms of speed, I would say AI should help me to achieve the same result quicker or with less effort, or more efficient, so to speak. So the knowledge remains more or less the same, but we have a quicker or a more efficient way of processing that knowledge or getting the same output. Then smarter, like I said, it would help me solve a problem that I cannot do on my own. So for instance, processing large amounts of data, finding patterns in that data, and doing complicated computations on that. So for instance, it could help me provide answers or identify trends that me, myself, as a limited forensic pathologist would not be able to do so. That latter thing is, of course, the more academically interesting, but also the more challenging one. So what has been done so far about artificial intelligence in forensic medicine and forensic pathology specifically? Well, this is a graph from a review of this year, actually. And as in every part, well, I would say in every graph that we see of this kind, we see that the number of publications on this particular subject increases. Of course, that must always be viewed in the fact that scientific publications increase every year in general. But still, it shows you that artificial intelligence is becoming more and more published in the international literature. However, more in this regard is relative, I would say. If we look at the actual number of papers, so 5 in 2000, 6 in 2021, 2022 was the year in which the data gathering was ceased. So this is up until April 2022. 2 papers, 5 papers or 6 papers a year is not necessarily a massive amount of work. Then what are those papers that are being published? Well, first of all, there's quite a large amount of reviews. And these reviews, they discuss essentially the presence of AI or what it is. They translate the concept of AI to forensic practitioners, but they don't really provide any new research. So they are more or less discussing the general background, and they highlight the application in other fields, but they don't actually contain any primary research. And I would say that many of these reviews up till date have a very large blue sky gazing part to them, or very much a talking about the potential, but not really focusing on the implementation of that potential. But then there's a smaller proportion of papers who actually do something with AI in the forensic domain. So and many of those actually of that original work, it focuses on the automation of what is now a manual task. So this is, for instance, an example of 2019. So, and this deals with the automatic screening of diatoms. Now, diatoms are small plankton type organisms found in bodies of water. And if you find these diatoms within the body of somebody who was found in a body of water, it could support a diagnosis of drowning. So in that sense, it can be an interesting or a relevant piece of information if you find these diatoms in these bodies. However, the identification, finding these diatoms is extremely laborious. There's a manual step involved that requires people to screen multiple slides of histology, microscopic slides, to find these tiny bits of plankton. Now, that manual time-consuming process is automated by these authors, showing that the number of diatoms is the same between AI and various experts, more or less, but that it does so in much less time. So, and this is using a convolutional neural network to do so. This is done on 42 histological slides, and then indeed tested in 5 cases. So it shows that AI has the potential to indeed, like I said, make some processes quicker. Similar types of research focusing on the identification of a singular finding are, for instance, the detection of hemorrhagic pericardial effusion, hemopericardium, which could indicate a particular type of cause of death, or, for instance, identifying fatal head injuries on postmortem CT scan, or identifying which particular organ is depicted on a photo, or classifying different phases of myocardial infarction. Now, all these studies have a fairly straightforward, almost like proof of concept type of build-up, in which they have a limited amount of cases, which with a very clear-cut diagnostic criterion and a quite well-known ground truth, so to speak. So these are mostly essentially classification studies. And I think that AI is quite well suited to indeed automate these type of decisions. If we then move to the more complex questions, so the doing something smarter, the literature is much scarcer. These are 3 examples which I could find. For instance, the first study is a pilot study to predict the kind of a vehicle that a deceased would hit by based on the injury pattern. So whether he was hit with a car or with a truck. The study describes a learning set of 130 cases, 70 by car, 60 by truck, and it selects 10 to 15 features that are predictive of the particular vehicle that the person was hit by. The predictive accuracy is actually not that high. It's about 70%. Similar studies, for instance, focus on the determination of life or stillbirth in fetuses, so whether a fetus was born alive or not. Same, takes a large amount of variables and then tries to distill from, by using AI, distill which features are indeed have a predictive value. The accuracy in that particular study was 90%. And the last is the determination of causes of death based on the composition of fluid in the lungs. However, these studies have important limitations because actually the predictive features or the diagnostic features used in these studies are already open for discussion. So there's actually not a lot of agreement on whether the features used to develop the AI are actually accurate. Also, in these studies, obtaining the ground truth, so actually knowing what is true in these cases, is often also quite difficult. And that, of course, muddies the water somewhat when you're talking about the accuracy or the specificity of these studies. Also, in forensic pathology, diagnostic features often have a wide variety of explanations. And if the classification is non-exhaustive, so for instance, in this last study, in which multiple causes of death are being compared, then that can lead to misleading results because the AI will have to choose between one of those four options. But the correct option is not necessarily part of the study. So my general impression of this overview is that overall very little has been done. Mainly they are straightforward classification studies, and there's lots of proof of principle or concepts and blue sky gazing around. Generally, these studies have a very small cohorts. There's no large samples done, and there's not a single evidence of a system actually being implemented in daily casework. And that is, I think, it has to do with the limitations of implementing AI within forensic pathology. I'm just going to discuss a little bit that more in detail. So first of all, we have the issue of individualization. So the fact that you have to make your findings or you have to make the science applicable to the specific case that you have under your wing at that moment in time. So in order to individualize successfully the general findings of research to a particular case, that requires that the cohort from which you derive your data is representative of the single case, of course. So you need large cohorts that encompass the variation that is present or that may exist. However, in forensic pathology, we don't have large quantities of labeled data. There's often a low number of comparable cases. Cases are often so distinct that it's very difficult to make a large cohort of similar cases. Richard already alluded that there's difficulties with performing experiments. And if those experiments are being performed, that experimental data hardly ever applies particularly to a case. There's lack of standardization, both from an input but also from an output point of view. So the type of data that we deal with differs, but also the way we report that data often differs. And the research output in forensic pathology is scattered, small, and of particularly variable quality. Also, forensic pathology is not necessarily a field of science where everything is already solved. I mean, we have considerable gaps in our scientific knowledge as forensic pathologists. We often lack clear-cut diagnostic criteria. There's often uncertainty about the ground truth that we're dealing with, and isolated findings that AI can easily deal with often have a low evidential value. So there's not a lot of gain to be made by focusing on isolated findings. However, if we move to findings and their interconnectedness, we often don't know how that works. So we actually don't know really a lot about the causal relations or the interactions between different variables and how they relate to our conclusions. So there's a lot of unknowns in forensic pathology. And that essentially makes that forensic pathology findings are often opinions with considerable inter-operator variability, and that, of course, makes it very difficult to do research. Then a little bit about how we use AI as evidence in court, and this is a famous picture, essentially depicting the black box problem. And I think that indeed, if we look at AI as evidence in court, we'll have to talk a little bit about the admissibility of evidence. AI is, especially the more complex forms of AI, are very difficult to understand for lay people. So, and not knowing what happens in your AI machine or in your automated process has huge implications in legal proceedings, because it means essentially that you cannot explain as an expert how you come to your answer. So that also means that as an expert, if you can't explain how you come to a conclusion or how you interpret the AI output, it makes it very difficult for you to explain that to a judge or a jury, and makes it essentially inadmissible. Also, a defense lawyer might find it extremely difficult to test the robustness of an AI output if the expert himself doesn't really know how the AI works. So this whole idea of AI solving problems that we can't, almost by definition, then implies that it's so difficult that the expert will struggle with explaining that in court. So we'll need to focus on understanding AI, and also how we explain it first to the users and then to relative lay people. And also, I think AI should be wary of the so-called CSI effect. So, like I said, often forensic pathologists give opinions, so we're not really sure. And I think that if a human expresses the uncertainty of a conclusion, that is relatively easily accepted as such. However, if a machine produces an output, you can have the unwanted effect that it's accepted as objective, whereas actually the underlying science is quite limited as well. So in general, to use it as evidence in court, the acceptance of AI in court is not only up to doctors, but I think also a question for society. To what extent do we allow AI to produce evidence that is then used in court? To what extent do we allow machines to take over the interpretation of evidence that we now let experts do? That's an issue I think that is unresolved. Like Richard already said, AI output will definitely require some form of human interpretation, but then again, that understanding of AI is important. And I think that the stakes in court are extremely high. I mean, I know that AI is now being used in so many processes, but however, an error often in those processes don't have the same effect as in court proceedings. So your Spotify playlist that is being generated by an AI can make a little slip. I mean, you just push next. However, of course, in a legal proceeding, the stakes are much higher. Okay, then a little bit about other limitations. Research, of course, costs money, but also the budget for implementing all this. I mean, we need computers, we need digital infrastructure, and so on and so on. And then what is the net gain of implementing AI? So, I mean, if you look at the studies done, those concept studies, recognizing organs on a photo is not necessarily a task that we need to outsource. Now, I know that these are proof of concept studies, but still, we need to look at what does it actually gain. I mean, we need to move from a proof of concept type of studies. We need to move towards implementation and deal with challenges there. So what do I believe are the opportunities for AI? Well, Richard already discussed this a little bit. I think that there's the main opportunities as I see them now are the pre-processing or the screening of data. So any form of information that we get can be pre-processed or screened and make suggestions that we then as humans interpret. But also the large registries for research, we can use AI to mine that data and to parse that data. So to translate data from one form to another. So it's usually that this is more or less an automated translation of info. If we look at the smarter options, I think that AI will definitely help us eventually with the multifactorial issues, but those multifactorial issues will have to have experimental potential. So we need to be able to experiment with them, or there must be non-contested ground truth. Because without that solid scientific basis, I don't think AI will help us to find an answer. Because if we can't agree on what the ground truth is, or if we can't agree on a good experimental setting, then I think that the results of AI will be suboptimal. Problems where this could be used would be, for instance, injury dating, post-mortem interval, interpretation of intracranial hemorrhage, gunshot directories, or injury biomechanics. And then I think AI can also help us to identify new diagnostic features, or even perhaps help us suggest explanations or propositions when we're dealing with a case. So I went a little bit over time, I'm sorry for that, but I think this is my view as a forensic pathologist on AI, and I hope it is helpful and it provides some context to what will come later this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Don't apologize at all. That was wonderful. Really important to have this very grounded view of what might be possible, but let's be real as we talk about AI and healthcare in general, let alone in your highly specific case. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Yasmin George, just to get her to pop her slides up. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A section that I'll direct our panelists' attention to. If you can unshare your screen, please, Hans, and then Yasmin will be able to share hers. The first question is probably more one, it could be for any of our speakers. They all have a different perspective. Some are doing research in this, some govern the process. The second question probably more for Richard and Hans to answer at their leisure in the Q&A window. But without any further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Yasmin George.
Yep, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Richard and Hans, for great presentations. I think you made it already easy for me to start my talk. So I will be talking, actually, it's nice to start with what Hans ended with, which is AI opportunities in forensic science. And I will focus on one of the initial projects we started in collaboration with VIFM, reconstructing defective skull. So the main, let me start quickly jump into what we wanted to do. We wanted to use AI, explore how AI can be used to identify subjects. And this project is a very small project in collaboration with VIFM, as I said, funded by leaders. And just to give a focus on the data we're using post-mortem medical images. And we're focusing on head gunshot injuries. So let me take you through why we wanted to do this, and I think Richard touched already on this one. So when we say identify subjects, we're talking about face recognition here, and it's been already deployed in so many businesses. I mean, I'm talking outside forensic context. We use it with our phones even to sign in for many software applications. Sorry. But even more interesting, taking this face recognition to another level. Last year, we've heard Richard was talking about the importance of having a face recognition technologies for mass fatality events or incidents. So last year, we've seen the Ukraine and Russian war. We've seen a Clearview AI company. They use the facial recognition software to identify the dead Russian soldiers. We've also just a couple of, actually, that was an article which is released yesterday on the left side. We've also seen some of the face forensics softwares, which is recently, it's been in a while, but they recently changed it to work with faces that has some injuries, and it's not it's incomplete faces, and even the software can work with these incomplete or faces with injuries or burns, and it can identify the subject or the person as well. But what we were keen to work with, what if all what we have is just skeletal remains? So we don't have, the person is already decomposed, as Richard was sharing his experience early. So that's when the forensic anthropology comes into the scene, where we need really to have a forensic facial approximation. So how we recreate the face of an individual who's decomposed. So all what we have is just the skeletal remains. This is very subjective, and it's multidisciplinary. It does involve an artist and a forensic anthropologist as well. Let me take you through quickly how this facial reconstruction happens manually. So if it can be 2D reconstruction, where based on, as Richard was saying, where we use the tissue depth markers, as on the left side image, a printed 2D image of the skull, and with the markers on the face, which guide the artist to draw the facial features guided by these markers. So that's the 2D version. The 3D version, where we have a 3D print of the skull, and we use the clay, and again, guided by the tissue depth markers, we can the 3D reconstruction can happen. But this is very time consuming, very subjective, as you can imagine. So when we work with post-mortem CT scans, as in the left side image here, that's hundreds of slices stacked on top of each other. That's for the head only. And when we do post-mortem CT scans, it's for the full body of the deceased person. We're focusing here on head CT scans. So what is the workflow for 3D face recognition or reconstruction? So once we have the CT scan, we can easily do 3D rendering of the segmented skull, as in the second picture column. And then we print the 3D and we start the clay sculpture of the face. But can AI automate this process? Yeah. Yes, there is some, and I completely agree with Hans, it's only very, very few AI work in forensic medicine. And there is a couple of research papers on forensic facial reconstruction. And I will just take you through the big idea, the overall idea of how this works using AI. So the way working with post-mortem CT scans has its own technical challenges, and I will share with you some of these technical challenges later on. But this work here, they did some artifact removal to improve or enhance the quality of the post-mortem CT scans. As you can see, there is on the top left image, there is some artifacts due to dental fillings. And then for each, from the post-mortem CT scan, they extracted pairs of 3D volumes, and they built their template database. First is they extracted the 3D segmented skull and the corresponding head, which is the 3D face with the skin on. And this can be easily extracted and segmented from the post-mortem CT scans. And they had this template database within cases. And what they did, they use it for a given target 3D skull to find, so they framed it as a registration problem. So for a new target skull, and we don't have the corresponding face because the person is deceased, what they did is that they tried to find the transformation parameters and basically registered this target skull into each of the template cases in their database. And based on this calculated or estimated transformation matrix, they applied it on the corresponding head, which is the corresponding 3D volume with the skin on, and they had an approximation of the face of this person, and that's for each pair in this template database, and then they averaged the final faces, and that's how they came up with a reconstructed face. But with Vipin, we had a very interesting, and as Richard was saying, they have really large number of post-mortem CT scans. And when we had a closer look at the cases for head gunshot, some of them were really damaged, were fragmented. So this is one of the skulls we worked with where it's really damaged because of the gunshot infliction. So before even one pre-processing step, before even we apply the face reconstruction, is to actually restore the skull. And that's exactly the very small project we started with, where we tried to work with head gunshot post-mortem CT scans and try to reconstruct the anatomical ante-mortem appearance of a deceased person prior to the infliction of gunshot trauma. So quickly, I'm not gonna talk in depth about the technical, but I will take you through the big idea, what we've done and how we approached this problem. We don't have any ground truth, any level data as been mentioned before. So what we've done is we tried to calculate an average skull of, we collected 20 skulls, and this skull doesn't have any injuries, any fragmentation. It was for normal people, and we created the average skull, and it's been validated by domain experts from Wipfen. And the whole idea was really to use the principal component analysis and statistical shape modeling to use this average computed skull and you fragmented or damaged skull and try to restore it based on this average skull. And the idea is that we calculate the shape variation between not sure if you can see, but we create this is the average skull, and we create based on the principal components, we create the shape variation that if we add it to the average skull, it will give us an input or a given skull. So we're in that, which is where we at the moment, is that we calculated the average skull. It's been validated, but we're in the process to find the best number of principal components that can give us a reasonable restored skulls. As has been mentioned before, it will take us so much time to validate it because it has to be validated by domain experts, and this takes time. But what's next step for this project, also apart from the validation and working with these best parameters for principal component analysis, is that we needed to use this model to create an auxiliary or pseudo labels, which is labeled the data set for the deep learning to give us better reconstruction results. So we will use it to generate the ground truth data, training data for us, and that's hopefully the next step. Aware of time, I'll quickly go through another quick experiment we've done in this area, where we try to, because we don't have any ground truth data, and this has been a big issue in working with post-mortem CT scans, we try to simulate the data in using Astra tool, that's a Bison toolbox, where we try to simulate and all the structures which is present in one of the slices in the 3D scan. And the easy why we wanted to do that, because it was easy for us to control the level of noise in the generated slices and the fragmentation and how difficult the fragmentation is. And we framed this problem as a image in painting problem, where we needed, given this slice on the, I hope you can see the cursor, on the left column, which is the 2D simulated slice with the fragmentation, that we can train a deep learning model to reconstruct the original slice after fixing this fragmentation or damage. So we framed it, as I said, as an image in painting problem. And I'm not gonna also, I will quickly describe the method. And the idea is that we have an input image with some missing pixels, and guided by the edges, we will train a model that will try to predict the edges first. That's the first phase. And based on the predicted edges, along with the input corrupted image, that will give us a better prediction or completion for the image, the missing parts in the image. So we trained, this is one of the already implemented work, but it's used with different data sets. So we used the same architecture and applied it on the generated slices. And the reconstruction or the image in painting results were strong. I think we're at stage where we need to analyze it for separate structures. For example, what was the image in painting results accuracy for the bullets? Does it change any of the anatomical structure of any of the structures which is in the head? So we visually examining the results visually, it wasn't perfect. The similarity score was 0.84. And just looking at some of the failure cases, there is some of the, for example, this is the bullets on the left image, and in the predicted image or slice, we didn't have this bullet, which is not the case. We shouldn't have this case, because this is very important for forensic pathologists when they write down evidence or the cause of death. I'm aware of time. I will just quickly go through this one. There is some technical challenges when we apply AI for forensic medicine using post-mortem CT scans. There is a significant amount of noise that needs to be reduced first before we train the deep learning model. And this comes from different types of, there's different types of noises even. Potential of AI, and I'm going to talk only within the gunshot data that and this has been touched on before, but maybe will be the focus on the gunshot data. For bullet, we can actually have this segmentation and localization of the bullet, and even the trajectory of the bullet is being the entry and the exit points on the scan identified, so the forensic pathologist can then we can give them this information and they can do their work. We can even do a lot of classification models, but it's all based on, we can even identify the type of weapon and bullet, and Hans was touching on how it's been already AI work, which predicts the type of vehicle based on from the post-mortem CT scans. We can even predict the type of weapon and bullet and the mechanism of injury, the distance from which the shooting happened, the height, and this is also some of this already being touched on in the literature work, but not as much. Identify the height of the shooter or the direction or trajectory of the bullet. So I will just summarize what I've been talking about in one sentence, really. There is not much work being done for AI models in the forensic medicine, and this has to do with all the issues with the data labeling and also ethics aspects, as mentioned before. I would like to thank Chris Bain and Richard for their work in this project, and hopefully we'll share with you some of the results in the upcoming seminars. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. We won't have time for questions right at the minute, but there's some we could talk to later. I'll ask Tim to slowly share his slides. I just wanted to pick up on a point that Hans made earlier as a segue into Tim's talk. Hans mentioned, if you recall his slide with the cheetah and the owl, the concept that for AI to be useful in his work, and this applies in medicine and healthcare more generally, it needs to augment his performance in some way, either through additional insights and wisdom or through efficiency. So often when I'm talking to people about technologies like AI and machine learning, I actually use a different acronym of AI called augmented intelligence. So the whole point of those technologies is to augment the performance of the patient or the doctor or the human being. And you might be able to see in this next talk by Tim a different suite of technologies and how they might augment human performance, even though they're not what we would call AI. So over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I have been wondering about how to make that connection. I think the way I'm thinking about mixed reality more and more is as kind of the user interface of the future. If we anticipate that more and more activities will be supported by artificial intelligence in many different forms, then in order to take that technology, the utility of that technology out of the desktop computing environment and the screen and out into activity in the real world, that's the opportunity for mixed reality. And so that's very much what I'm talking about now. This is work largely done by Vahid Youssef, who is our PhD student. Really, he has done amazing work for the last year or so, really implementing all the tools that you're going to see and running a very detailed set of rigorous studies, working closely with and user-centered design, working closely with the pathologists and at the VIFM. Okay, so also involved, Richard co-supervises Vahid with me at Monash, and also Maxime Cordel and Lonnie Besançon, former Monash academics who during COVID had to go back to be close to their families. So Maxime is now at UQ and Lonnie is at Linköping University in Sweden. One more person on this list here is Christoph Herter, who is another mixed reality technology expert. He's based in France at the University of Toulouse, and interestingly, his main area is aviation. So he does a lot of work, a lot of kind of studies, a little bit similar to this one, but with people like air traffic controllers. So anyway, that's who we are. Once again, huge credit to Vahid, who will be presenting this work at the CHI conference, the Human-Computer Interaction Conference in Germany in just a few weeks. Yeah, that's where we are to. So I'm not sure how necessary this warning is for this audience, but just in case, there is imagery of CT scans of homicide victims in this. It's not anonymized, but it still might be disturbing. So if you're likely to be disturbed, then don't watch. Okay, so this is a prototype system that Vahid has been developing using mixed reality. So this is Vahid himself wearing a HoloLens 2 device, a Microsoft HoloLens 2 augmented reality headset, and he's walking around a imagery from a CT scan of a cadaver. And you see sort of immediately the idea of mixed reality in this context. So compared to viewing CT imagery on a screen, here you get mobility. You can walk around a model the way that you would walk around a physical cadaver in the morgue. You can use freehand gestures to interact with the various interface elements in the environment. And freehand gestures also mean that it can be used in sterile environments, meaning you don't have to re-glove after using a keyboard, for example. Also gives you kind of embodied interaction with life-size models. So again, more like physical autopsy. And finally, it gives you a 360-degree view of imagery. So imagery doesn't need to be bounded by the physical dimensions of a screen. So these kind of capabilities of mixed reality technology have found application in a number of different areas of clinical medicine, from anatomy training, so allowing trainee surgeons and so on to see, to learn about anatomy from 3D images rather than from pictures in books or flat images on a screen, to surgery, simulation, and also for guidance in actual surgery. So that's kind of where the state of the art is. However, in this work, we are looking at autopsy, and we did this through a user-centered design process, working with forensic professionals at VIFM, and we are interested in what unique opportunities there are to support sense making, the pathologist's sense making process when in doing digital autopsy. Okay, so there's a little bit of work in mixed reality or extended reality. We might be using XR and MR interchangeably in this talk. They're essentially the same thing. So the current approaches that have been tried, however, in forensic medicine are fairly basic, and tend to be just using kind of windowed visualizations of CT scans overlaid in mixed reality. So that is more a straightforward adaptation of existing image viewing software to MR. To facilitate adoption in real-world autopsy workflows and to take full advantage of the technology of mixed reality, we need to develop integrated systems with more sophisticated capabilities. And so to do this effectively, we need to work really closely with domain experts to properly understand their needs and for them to understand the possibilities offered by mixed reality, both now and in the future. So it's, like I said, Vahid has done a lot of work in the last year, and this diagram is intended to map out what's been quite a complex methodical process of user-centered design. So it consisted of 4 phases of user feedback and evaluation, involving in total 15 participants and 3 prototyping phases. And those 15 participants, by the way, represent a pretty good representation of pathologists, forensic pathologists in Australia. So it's not a huge statistically significant number that you can do controlled studies with, but it is a significant fraction of the base of experts available in the country. In the following slides, I'm going to dive into each of these 4 phases. Starting with phase 1. So phase 1, we started with individual interviews of forensic experts, and at this stage we were focused mainly on their existing practice and more abstract kind of possibilities, trying to ignore the specifics of the technology. So we didn't show them any prototypes or demos of mixed reality technology at this stage. Rather, we wanted to ensure that the participants could objectively identify challenges and tasks without being influenced or preconceived by preconceived possibilities or limitations of the technology. And feedback from these interviews, coupled with our literature review, allowed us to identify procedures and challenges for an initial prototype, which I'll show you in a second. For one example of the kind of feedback, we found that some of the most important activities, identifying trauma and fractures through CT imagery in combination with physical examination and dissection, and some examples of challenges include difficulty accessing materials such as police reports from inside the mortuary, and the need to, because of the need to remove gloves to take notes or to use computers. Okay, so that led to the development of a prototype system where we kind of using that first round of feedback as inspiration, but otherwise letting our imaginations kind of go wild, we created just a very first prototype to capture some key ideas. So the key features that this system demonstrated were an integrated platform for exploring CT slice viewers. So obviously, pathologists are trained to look at slices of CT scans. So seeing a very controlled slice view is complementary to the 3D view that you see down here. So this is the 3D visualized body recomputed from the scans. And we created a novel set of interface elements to support mid-air hand gestures to place the cutting planes that give you these cross-section views at the back wall. And also interface elements to allow pathologists to explore medical reports and police reports in situ while they're looking at the imagery, as well as some basic things like controlling the lighting in the environment. Okay, the next phase involved taking this prototype and using it as a stimulus in an exploratory workshop with two objectives. So first, we were looking for feedback on our prototype, including use cases, potential improvements and limitations. And second, we wanted to evaluate the effectiveness of a co-design approach for this technology and domain. We think that this is the first kind of study of this type in this domain. So really interested to not only develop new technology, but also to reflect on our own user-centered design process. During the workshop, we showcased several video demonstrations and provided participants with the opportunity to try a live demo and use our prototype with a Microsoft HoloLens 2, which is the headset that you saw Vahid wearing in that first video. And participants throughout the course of the workshop identified potential use cases for our prototype, including, and these are quotes, easy access to information inside the mortuary, an integrated system for forensic settings, and they also provided suggestions for additional tools to analyze CT images and to access all forensic data. There were some difficulties, mainly related to the limitations of the HoloLens 2 device as it is now. It's still a little bit clunky and occasionally loses tracking and that sort of thing. So we tried to decouple in the work going forward, we tried to decouple the limitations of the specific device from the potential of the technology. In terms of the workshop's second objective, we found that participants with limited, that is reflecting on this user-centered design process, we did find that participants with limited XR experience have trouble ideating use cases. That is, if they don't really understand the technology, then it's hard for them to imagine or seeing how it's used in other situations. It can be hard for them to see how it would be useful in their own work. As a result, our user-centered XR design process, as the rest of this talk discusses, leans heavily on prototyping. That is, creating creating prototypes, showing them to users and evaluating them with users, and then iterating on the design. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so our next prototype, we implemented a variety of techniques exploring different styles of interactions and visualizations, including 3D manipulation of the data. So this is going beyond just viewing imagery the way that they're used to, but really trying to find novel ways to interact with the 3D imagery that perhaps gets a bit closer to the idea of digital autopsy, that is recreating 3D dissection in an immersive environment. Specifically, the techniques that we developed are in clockwise order. Color tunneling. So up the top left here, we see that the user controls a kind of cursor with their hands, which pushes the low density tissue voxels out of the way so that you can see underlying structures. Then the next one is a cutting shape, so a way to again dissect the image and pare away the parts of the volume that you're not interested in. The third one, bottom right, is we called it an eraser technique, so it allows you to quite precisely remove or erase tissue, controlling of different densities. So you can cut away low density tissue, soft tissue, and expect bone or medium density tissue in between. And finally, the bottom left, this zoomable slider allows you to very precisely position a cross-section view of the volume. Okay, so the next thing we did was more of a, well, the first couple of sessions were more ideation sessions. The next thing we did was more like a traditional user study, although with only a small number of participants, because as I said, we wanted to focus on expert users and really still elicit their expert knowledge. So it was sort of a qualitative study, but really looking at the usability of these different prototypes that we had developed. Yeah, so we found that some of the highlights, I guess, were that color tunneling was found to help the pathologists looking at external and internal tissues. They really liked the color tunneling interface. They also gave us a lot of suggestions for potential applications, from teaching to demonstration to colleagues and in court. So communicating with a non-expert jury, this kind of 3D imagery could be helpful. And also freehand interaction inside the jury. So here's some sort of detailed results. We found that the eraser tool was the easiest to use. By contrast, the color tunneling was a bit more difficult to use, but the pathologists really liked it. So as a result, for the next prototype, we kind of came up with a hybrid. So this technique here that we're showing, it allows you to either erase voxels or to push them out of the way, kind of non-destructively. So we also refined the interaction in a number of ways to make it as easy to use as possible. And let's go ahead and show you the demonstration. So you can see again, they're controlling a kind of spherical cursor, and it selectively either pushes the boxes of the lower density tissue out of the way or removes it entirely. Another tool that we integrated was a measuring tool. So this was based on feedback that a really important activity in the mortuary is measuring various parts of the body, for example, bone length and things like that. And so we made a tool that we tried to make as easy to conduct that activity as possible. Okay, so then with this new tool, we conducted a follow-up user study to assess the effectiveness of this refined technique, but more importantly, to get feedback from the experts in a more realistic scenario of a death investigation. So participants found the new interactions for the color tunneling easier to use and more memorable, and preferred the refined interactions over some of the ones that we had shown them previously. During the study, participants were asked to measure the length and penetration of the knife and the location relative to anatomical landmarks, as well as to measure several organs using all of the techniques. So this last phase, after reviewing the whole task and process, our key findings highlight that this system and technology allows experts to investigate the cause of death, this mixed reality technology and the interface that we provided. The metaphors that we designed were felt to be fairly well suited to the forensic activity, being inspired by and reminiscent of physical autopsy and dissection. We found that the tool enables reproducible autopsies for documentation and teaching purposes. So we can record the dissection process and take imagery from different angles and that sort of thing. And also that it can augment physical autopsies with so a combination of using the augmented reality to complement physical autopsy in the actual mortuary. As well as these other activities here. Okay, so to conclude, I think this was really interesting for us, being hopefully interesting for the pathologists as well, and hopefully ultimately leading to usable tools. In all honesty, the technology is not quite ready for to replace existing autopsy techniques. Obviously, there was a question about ethics in digital autopsy, and obviously one goal would be to replace the need for physical autopsy with digital autopsy, which would obviously be preferable for families. It could be less time consuming than having to go to a physical mortuary, but we're not there yet. There are, however, other perhaps use cases where mixed reality technology might be useful sooner, and I might just use the last couple of minutes to show you that. So this is Vahid's latest prototype, and the idea here is to facilitate the report writing process. So pathologists obviously have to create quite detailed reports, which become useful in court proceedings and that sort of thing. And moving back and forth between the mortuary and a desktop computer to author these kind of documents is tedious. And so in this prototype that Vahid's created, he is making it really easy for pathologists to construct the report by dragging and dropping imagery onto that wall display in the background there. And it also supports a kind of collaborative scenario where you can imagine that multiple pathologists, perhaps remote, so not even in the same state potentially, perhaps different types of pathology experts could collaborate to in a shared immersive environment and to do this kind of report writing, as you can see there. So that's kind of the end of my talk, and who am I handing back to now?
I've got it, Tim. Thank you very much. I'm always super pleased, Tim, when I'm learning things I haven't heard before, having been aware of the project. So it's great to see some of that later work. I'll refer you, Tim. Actually, there's a question you can just answer either in the text or verbally in a second about what measures are in place to ensure the security of the technology and prevent any external access that could potentially tamper with evidence. That's sort of a general security of mixed reality systems questions potentially too. But do you want to take that on now?
Sure. So I guess at the moment it's these the imagery is either being used by Vahid in VIFM in a secure facility and the not on live cases. I don't think Richard would know more about that, but I'm pretty sure they are cases that have been the scans that we've got not sensitive in that sense. And but looking forward, I guess, yeah, obviously security of data is going to be a concern. I don't think that's specific to augmented reality or mixed reality. I think anytime you're moving data around over the internet, you've got to make sure it's secure. Yeah, I think actually that's an important use case for mixed. Yeah, talking about in the context of all these AI tools and trying to use AI to not replace but support experts. You need, I think Richard introduced this concept, human in the loop analytics. You need to have ways to for the domain expert pathologist to verify and go back to the source imagery. And I guess that's the opportunity here is user interfaces that allow people to see the source of automated tools and verify. So that's a kind of security, I guess. The other kinds of security, I'm not an expert in cybersecurity, so I can't speak too much on that. But of course, it's secure communications are important too.
Thanks, Tim. I might just add to that too, from a more general digital health perspective. If we come back into the healthcare world, if you think about a patient having some kind of wearable data from the wearable being collected and sent to the cloud, sent to some kind of AI system, the results pushed to a clinician, how can the clinician know that that data hasn't been interfered with over the chain of transmission? That's a real challenge. There's work I've been involved in with colleagues about that, both securing, if you like, the provenance of the data as it moves, and then giving an end user of the data, like a clinician, some kind of rating scale of the level of trust they can have in the data. And sometimes if it's a less important clinical application, maybe they'll accept a lower level of trust. So if it's something really critical like an ECG reading and prediction of arrhythmia or automated diagnosis of arrhythmia, you'd want a high level of trust. So these concepts are really important that we infuse through all this kind of research, and no doubt has legal connotations too, because you don't want a defence lawyer turning around saying, well, you can't prove to me that that wasn't tampered with, bringing down the whole case. So acknowledge the importance of that question. I just wanted to come back to a question that popped up earlier, and this is really for Richard and Haynes. Are you aware of anybody anywhere around the world actually using an AI output in court? And if so, how was it received?
I don't know. I mean, AI is of course very broad, but within forensic pathology, I don't know of a particular example. I do know that, for instance, the Department of Cyber Crime at the Netherlands Forensic Institute is a very, very large cybercrime department, and they use various forms of AI to, for instance, sift through heaps of data. For instance, when they, I think it was 2 years ago, they had disencrypted messages from a international drug gang, and all those messages had to be sifted through, and it all had to be categorized, and so on and so on. So that is, and they actually have a particular program for that, which they also which they sell, I believe, to police departments. It's called Hansken, and I think that is all AI based. So because a police officer nowadays has to deal with so much more information, and they don't know what is actually relevant, I think they've developed a tool to help police officers sift through that. As a matter of fact, when that was first brought to court, there was, in the Netherlands, there was a lot of discussion about that, indeed, whether there's no implicit biases, how the method actually works. But within forensic pathology, I don't know of any example, no.
Richard, do you have a comment?
Yeah, the closest parallel I can come up with is the court cases that involve facial recognition technology and identifying, people in crowds that are suspected of possibly being a terrorist, or identifying criminals from or suspected criminals from low resolution CCTV camera footage and photographs taken in the dark and at funny angles and that sort of stuff. I know that they've gone to court a number of times, and I'm unsure as to whether that evidence has actually been questioned, because I'm also unsure that the legal fraternity probably doesn't know what questions to ask, because this technology is so new, but it is expanding so rapidly. I'm pretty sure that the legal profession hasn't actually caught on to some of the implications as yet.
Am I right in hearing you both talk too, that unlike maybe the medical environment where something, let's say we have an AI diagnostic tool, unless it passed regulatory checks, it won't get in the environment, and it needs a lot of evidence on to get there, that in fact in the legal setting, someone can bring something to court and the court tests it then. Does that make sense? That's correct. Yeah. So that
seems to be, they test the validity of the expert in terms of their experience, their qualifications, their background. But a lot of bad evidence has gotten through and still sometimes gets through in certain sort of fringe aspects of forensic medicine and science. And that's a problem. If then that's just standard evidence given by opinion evidence given by a person. So how the court deals with what's effectively, almost opinion evidence given by a machine, I guess, one way of putting it, how that works.
Yeah, it's a very big issue within the quality of forensic science nowadays. Indeed, how do you know that an expert is an expert, and how do you know that the methods that they use are correct? I mean, usually a court looks at whether a method is accepted by the professional body that that expert is part of. So, for instance, we look at forensic pathology guidelines, the board certified forensic pathologist, and so on and so on. And by looking at that, the judge then, essentially the judge then decides whether he believes that the expert is good enough. In terms of the methods that an expert uses, there are some guidelines, or there are some benchmarks. So methods need to be peer reviewed. Usually, they need to be published. They need to be used by more than one particular expert. But essentially, the expert witness is defined by the fact that he or she has knowledge that the trier of fact doesn't have. So there's this, by definition, there's a difference in knowledge. Yes. And it's a really big issue. how you test the reliability of a witness, yes, and especially in cases in forensic pathology where much rides on the forensic pathology evidence, you see a high percentage of late exonerations, for instance, or wrongful convictions, because experts are just humans. So there's that's a big problem.
A good example, I guess, of that would be the number of exonerations discovered by the Innocence Project on bite mark analysis and bite mark evidence.
Yeah.
I mean, that was considered such a strong form of forensic evidence for a lot of years, right through the 70s and 80s into the 90s. And it's completely been, by any scientific body who's actually looked at the foundational validity or validity as applied for bite mark evidence, has found absolutely no scientific merit at all. And they don't even see a path forwards into making it a valid science. So, and people are still presenting bite mark evidence in court. I was asked to go and give testimony on a bite mark last week in court. So it's still being asked for, and the message just doesn't seem to be getting through the legal fraternity that this is junk science. So the legal fraternity, they're pretty slow grinding through their processes and methods and adopting new things. So I can see us having a bit of an uphill challenge in getting them to, one, understand the implications of AI, and two, being able to accept the maybe limited explanation we'll be able to give as to why it's come up with this particular answer, and then trying to give them a level of comfort that this evidence is actually reliable and valid.
So just to be clear, though, I mean, what I'm hearing is if you did a piece of research work and published it that showed some algorithm we collectively come up with could identify age of bruising off a bruised picture, you could tomorrow take that to court and say, based on this work we've done, we believe this bruise is X days old, and yes, our opinion has been heavily informed by this system this tool, this algorithm we've built.
And here's my peer-reviewed paper.
As soon as you find an expert that is willing to present that as his method, then you're in.
Very interesting, isn't it? Very interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, for the audience too, checking the numbers, we've still got some good numbers. There's a whole bunch of other work we're doing in this space with the Institute. Things like technology facilitated sexual assault. We have another laboratory in the faculty or in the university called the ALEX lab, which is about AI for law enforcement. They'll be picking up that work, and so that will look at can we identify using computational techniques, particularly worrying text exchange or social media exchanges that might warn people this person's online presence is not genuine. That's a big, tricky piece of work, but that's going on. There's work, very basic work still in digital pathology and AI and the analysis of histology specimens. I guess my question to you, Richard, is, in theory, the sky's the limit. What are the constraints on this? What are the rate limiting steps?
So rate limiting steps in terms of development of algorithms and things, it's purely down to funding, bums on seats for professional researchers to want to be involved. I think there's no end of interest around the place. I've certainly struck nothing but interest in this sort of work, and when people understand it, the various possibilities that we can achieve. But you're right about, and the other thing with ALEX, which I think is really interesting, and this gets back to the question of ethics of looking at all this, quite confronting data and data being migrated from one place to another for research, is the idea that we have with ALEX of data airlocks, and the idea that you can not have to view this stuff, but you can push an algorithm into the database and get your answers out without having to view horrible images, for example. So ALEX and the AFP are very interested in that in terms of all the work they do trawling the internet looking for sexual assault imagery and child abuse imagery, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite a horrible thing for a policeman to have to sit there all day looking at this sort of stuff. Is there a way we can allow them to avoid looking at that stuff using machine learning? And that's pretty impactful in terms of the mental health of the law enforcement officers, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a really interesting prospect that I'll explore further with ALEX.
Yes. Now, I'm not sure they're still running it, but again, for the audience, ALEX Lab were running a project seeking voluntarily provided images of people when they were children to use as reference data in trying to build these systems that would identify children potentially in abuse scenario. We have a question there from Carolyn Brand. Hello, Carolyn. I'm glad you could make it. There are guidelines for assessing the merit of trials such as RCTs. Have there been any developments of a similar critical approach to reviewing AI papers? That might be one for Yasmin, maybe even Tim, about how do we validate AI papers?
Tim, yeah, you give it a go, Tim.
You're on mute, Tim.
I should probably actually defer to Yasmin. I guess, except to say again that in general, I'm really interested in the notion of explainable AI and user interfaces that allow us to understand AI reasoning, which is quite different to human reasoning, and it's a real challenge. And that's really all I have to say that's intelligent there. So I'll hand over to Yasmin, who's a proper AI researcher now.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, definitely explainable AI is one way nowadays we validate the AI approaches, but within each paper and within the techniques we use, there is different types of validation. And this could go from visual validation, just by visually examining the results, up to quantitative validation, and also comparative results, where we compare our techniques with related work and other baseline techniques. And now, if we read any AI paper, if we propose an approach, we have most likely the authors compare it to at least 5 other baseline approaches, and that's how they show that their approach works well. So quantitative approaches, this comparative approaches, qualitative, which is visual validations, and definitely, which is the one which takes time, but it's definitely very important to involve domain experts. And when we work with medical data, clinicians that validate the results and give us their validation. But then, if the question is to compare AI papers together, like comparative across AI papers, this has not been done. It's usually when we develop techniques, we do the evaluation for this technique.
Just to add to that, I know Carolyn has a medical background. When we look at the use of AI-enabled tools in healthcare, and we'll include the forensic medicine pathology space in that as well, there's still then, beyond the technical proficiency, is sort of the so what question for healthcare, and does it help in healthcare, and how do we measure that? A really good example is a very well-established system now called Cardia, K-A-R-D-I-A. Find it readily online. It's a purchasable product. It has been for a long time. People in Australia even use it. Basically a digital health system for analysing ECGs off a little sensor that you can use yourself connected to your phone. They then can automatically diagnose arrhythmias. They did a study a few years ago, probably about 5 years ago now, using it in prospective identification of cases of atrial fibrillation. 500 older adults were a control arm who just went about their life and saw how often over a year they were diagnosed with atrial fibrillation, and the other 500 adults, older adults, had used that little system twice per week, prospectively, deliberately, to see if they could identify cases of atrial fibrillation. The group using the system identified atrial fibrillation 4 times more often than the control group. But anybody with some medical training then goes, well, that's interesting, potentially we can use that, but was that actually valuable to those patients? Did something different happen in those groups? Did we just raise a lot of false alarms in the process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So there's still that overlay of what's the medical and healthcare utility and how do we measure that as well? Look, I'm conscious that we're coming into the last few minutes and we have lost a few people online. So I'm just going to very quickly, just bear with me again, just share the slide that has my email address on it. So if anybody has any questions for our speakers, you can contact me at that email address. But I'd really like to now thank our speakers today. So to thank Associate Professor Richard Bassett and Dr. Hans de Boer from VIFM, our great collaborators and friends who've been working with us for about 5 years now on these issues. And also to thank Dr. Yasmin George and Professor Tim Dwyer from the Faculty of IT, who are IT experts. I'm hoping those of you who aren't involved in the building of IT systems got a glimpse today into the complexity of building some of these systems. And the art is delivering something that seems very simple to an end user, but in fact has a lot of complexity under the hood. So thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to Heather Beveridge and the events team at Monash FIT for supporting our events. Thank you to everybody who's attended. We really appreciate your support and we hope today's event's been very interesting. We have monthly events going on like this through to the end of the year. And as we've discussed earlier, you should get a link to be able to view this if you missed the first half or if you want to share it with colleagues of yours. So with that, I shall sign off and thank you again very much, everybody, for your participation. Thanks, everyone.